This show is quite unique in that it's typography driven, and that's not something that you see in galleries typically. It's not something that we spend a lot of time thinking about unless we're graphic designers, and then maybe we spend too much time thinking about it. And one of the quotes that I'm using to talk about that is an Eric Gill quote, "Fonts are things, not pictures of things." We have this relationship that starts at kindergarten with fonts, and actually probably before that. So for me, inspiration is very keyword driven, and that happens in font development, but also graphic design. Modern poise is a great example of that. The keywords that I wanted to reference were flowing, but precise and strong, and I think it does all of those things. The precision comes in kind of the pill shape that you see in all of the counters of the font, and it's also very even in weight throughout, except for when we get to kind of the flowing parts, and then it switches up a little bit. So it's kind of a melding of a lot of different things that you don't expect in a font, which I guess I wanted my font to be very unexpected. People are out there designing fonts that they used or that they built from already existing forms. If you don't start with pen and paper, or pencil and paper, then you're not really designing an authentic font, in my opinion. You're carrying on someone else's creativity. The process I start with always starts with those keywords. It always starts with pencil and paper and kind of just exploring shapes. And once I've developed a couple of letters, those letters then help me flesh out the rest of the font, and everything's drawn by hand before I move on. Then there's another level of changes that happen once I hit a digital environment, just because it has its hand in the way things work out. But that digital process has a pretty big hand in it, just in those curves and how the movement happens. And obviously I can't be quite as precise in those hand sketches as I might want to be. And then of course I move on to a program like Font Lab, where I compile the font, I look at kerning and how it's working between each letter form. That's something that we all take for granted, but we all know that when we encounter a really cheap font, that somebody hasn't really spent the time to produce a font in the way that it needs to be. And I have to look at the relationships between each one of those pairs, so an A and an A and a B and a B, and I have to do that uppercase, lowercase. So that's a pretty big part of it as well. So Shelton Matthews is a great example of a project-driven letter form, actually, that could be built into a font, and it's something that I have always wanted to do. It's a very, very elaborate S that I created for a chocolate company. And it's not actually easy to do logos for a chocolate company, because what do you have to work with? Not much. And again, that's where keywords came back into play. I thought of the euphoria that chocolate lovers get, and so I wanted that reference of euphoria in the logo and in that letter form. And they have 3 different versions of their logo, one for a basic chocolate line, one for an intermediate chocolate line, and one for their very, very fancy premium chocolate line, and that's where the custom S comes in. My favorite letter of all times is G, just because I think that there's something really alluring in the curves and the way that it's formed, and then it has multiple versions. I love the idea of an ear on a letter form, because I give them little personalities. So the G has an ear, and if you don't know about that, go look it up. It's actually one of the most difficult letters to draw. It's right up there with S, just because you really have to think about how you're going to handle that descender line and stopping it early enough, and that's not easy. I think Modern Poise is actually a great example of that. I would actually love to have the lower part of that G be a little bit bigger, but if I did, it would totally be out of character with the rest of the Descenders. I've always been driven by quotes as a way to kind of tap into a subject. There are certainly lots of projects that I've dropped in quotes into the project without the client even kind of blinking an eye. They loved the idea of the quote kind of summing up what they were doing. But I also wanted people to think about typography in a way that people who deal with it and who are super excited about it do, and so throwing out a couple of quotes to kind of get you in that mood and to push you into that place where typographers live is really what those quotes were intended to be about. My favorite quote is, "God is in the details," and that relates so heavily to design in general, but certainly type, because all of these letter forms have to share commonalities. They have to look like brothers and sisters. They have to feel like they're connected. And if you don't put those details in that make them feel connected and related, then it's going to fail as a font. So you can look at each character and think about its shape and what's unique about it, kind of in the same way that designers look at fonts, but we don't always get a chance to look at them in this way, to be as close to see all those nuances that make up a font. And it's funny how kind of awkward quite a few letters are when you blow them up. They're kind of a little messy around the edges, and that's certainly something that I worked really hard not to have happen in my letter forms. That's why all the letters for Modern Poise are vinyl and applied directly to the wall so that you're seeing that shape instead of a poster. I wanted it to be very, very unexpected. It's not easy to design a show about graphic design or typography in a gallery setting just because it's not something we expect to see there. I wanted you to focus on the letter forms and not an example of a poster that's displaying those letter forms. So that's one of the reasons why Modern Poise is displayed as it is, vinyl letters on the wall. I wanted it to be the thing that you focused on. I didn't want a poster explaining Modern Poise to be the thing that you focused on.